All right, here's 3 books that millionaires, that rich people read, that poor people typically do not. Now, before I talk about these 3 books, just let me preface this. These 3 books, it's not that that rich people read these 3 in particular. I'm going to give you these 3 because I found them to be very profound and very helpful. But it's more about the category of book that these fall into. And this is something that was pretty surprising to me because if I recount my reading journey or just my journey through life, I all throughout my 20s almost exclusively read psychology, religion, and fiction. Science fiction, fantasy. I read so many novels, and part of my story is that I wanted to be, the next Stephen King, and I wrote a couple of science fiction books, right? I love that world. And it wasn't until I started getting into entrepreneurship, into business, that I started reading nonfiction, started reading business books, self-help books, and started to expand my horizons. And that was very helpful because I could gain systems and frameworks and insights into how people had built the things that I was trying to build. And I could just go replicate those building blocks. But one of the things that you discover is that as you read self-help books, as you read business books, at a certain point you realize they're all kind of saying more or less the same things, just in slightly different ways. And I came to this realization around the time that we were building Escape Climbing, because we used a fundamentally different framework to build Invictus than we did Escape, than we did the window washing company, right? Like different frameworks that I had learned from different books. And the thing I realized is that pretty much any framework, any system applied with diligence is probably going to work, right? It's like that old quote that an idiot with a plan beats a genius without one every day. And you just have to have a plan. And after you read a certain number of business books, you know the plan. You don't need to read 116 business books. I did a video on that because, I had to read a lot of business books before I realized you don't need to read so many. And so then as I started to have success, like truly the business books did help me become successful, I started having access to more successful people. And I would sit down and I'd talk to them, and books, reading, that would always come up. Like there's a corollary between how successful people are and how much they read. I'm not saying you have to read to be successful. I'm just saying it really fucking helps. And I'd sit down with these people and I'd ask them, what are you reading? What books do you like? Or I'd look at their bookshelves, right? I'd go to their office and look at the books on their shelves. There was one type of book that just kept coming up over and over and over again. And it was a type of book that I had never really read up to that point. That category of books rather, are biographies. Biographies. Now, I always steered away from biographies because I found them, most of them are really dense, really thick, really heavy, 1,000-page things that you dive deep into somebody's life. And I'm like, I don't really care that much, right? I just want to make money. And what's reading a 1,000-page book about Winston Churchill? What's that going to do for me? Well, it turns out that it's one of the highest leverage ways to consume information about incredible people. It's when you read a biography, you get to the distilled and yet still very dense information about a person, about their characteristics, about the patterns that they went through in their life, the obstacles they overcame, how they thought through the different problems and opportunities that came their way. And you start to embody that person's essence. You start to understand them in a very deep way. And the reason I think so many successful people read biographies is because it gives you, like, when else are you going to get to spend 25 uninterrupted hours with the most incredible humans that humanity has ever produced, right? Think about 25 hours with Steve Jobs, 25 hours with Elon Musk, regardless of whether you agree or like them or not, doesn't matter. 25 hours with Theodore Roosevelt, 25 hours with Genghis Khan. Not saying you gotta like that guy, but you would learn so much from these people that history has remembered for whatever reasons, right? By spending that much time with them, but you're never going to get that time. So biography is the closest that you're ever going to get to entering into the mind of somebody that did something incredible. And as you do this, as you read enough biographies, you start to see patterns. Not just patterns, but you start to see yourself. You start to see little glimpses of yourself into it. And the first book that I want to share with you is this book called Zeckendorf. William Zeckendorf. This is the autobiography of the man who played a real-life game of Monopoly and won the largest real estate empire in history. So this is actually an autobiography, not a biography. He wrote it himself, right? And it's very interesting. Now, Zeckendorf, he, like it says, he ran one of the biggest real estate empires in history. And I read this I've read this twice now. I read it recently because I've alluded to this in other episodes, but one of my businesses, the real estate portfolio and private equity, is going through a wildly tumultuous time right now. Partner disputes, lawsuits, all sorts of stuff going on. Terrible, right? And going through that is very difficult because there's not many humans who can understand and commiserate with you when you're like, hey, yeah, I'm struggling with this thing. Our $100 million portfolio is going through these struggles. And so where are you going to find a mentor? Where are you going to find somebody who you can relate to and hear their story of going through something similar? An autobiography, a biography. Read about this guy who he had the largest real estate portfolio in history, and he lost it all. Lost the whole thing. So not just a story of how he got the thing, but how he lost the thing. And so that's the first thing is like when you're struggling through life, you're going through hard times, reading a biography about somebody who's gone through and overcome similar or even crazier circumstances is incredibly powerful. Case in point, another great book is called The Lost Highlander. This is a book about a guy that he was a prisoner of war in World War II. He went through this horrible experience in these Japanese war camps. It was absolutely brutal. And I'm telling you, I don't care what you're going through right now. If your life is not how you want it, you're going through a breakup, you're on the verge of bankruptcy, whatever the thing is, read that book and you're not going to feel so bad about yourself. Okay? It could be worse. So that's book number one. Book number two that I want to recommend is called Open. This is the autobiography. Okay, I said these were biographies, but turns out these two are both autobiographies. Third one is a biography, I promise. But this is the autobiography of Andre Agassi. And Andre Agassi is, a great tennis player. And I love this book, not just this book. This book is beautiful. It's incredibly well written. One of the very first lines in the entire book is one of the most beautiful lines I've ever read in my life. This is going onto a tangent, but I want to share this line with you because I found it to be just so beautifully written. And he did not write this, by the way. He used a ghostwriter. So maybe it kind of is a biography. Anyway, he played tennis his entire life and he had drug issues. He had a real love-hate relationship with tennis. He claims that he hated it, that he only did it because he was good at it and his dad forced him to do it, kind of like an indentured servant almost. And his body was really breaking down towards the end of his career. He had a lot of back issues, a lot of pain that he was, self-medicating with drugs, right? And this line at the end, it's right before his very last match, or what would go on to be one of his last matches. And he's in the hotel room. He wakes up in the morning and he's recounting just how much physical pain he's in. Waking up, just having this body that's been playing a professional sport for the last 15 years, or longer than that since he was a child, right? And his body's just breaking down, and you get this glimpse into like what a professional athlete experiences when they're not on the court, when they're not in the arena in which you're familiar with seeing their greatness. And he said he gets out of bed and he falls to the floor because he can't quite stand at this point. And his kids are in the other room, and he hears them playing. And he says, hate brings me to my knees. Love gets me on my feet. Hate brings me to my knees. Love gets me on my feet. And he's talking about the hate that he had for tennis brought him to his knees because it broke his body. But his love for his children gets him to his feet to go out there, not just to play with them, but to go out there to the court and to play the next match, right? And the legacy and the impact that he can have on his family, right? This is an incredible book, and one of the reasons that rich people read books like this is because you get a glimpse into the mindset of somebody who is the best in the world at something. Like, when else do you get the opportunity to sit down and, again, spend 8-9 hours with somebody like Andre Agassi and get the mindset of what made him so great? And if you want to be great, you will see a lot of pieces of yourself in there, like that wrestling match between this activity that both defines you and that also destroys you, right? So this is an incredible book. And for a lot of people who are successful and rich, like, they find themselves threading this needle of obsession with their business, where it's not about work-life balance, it's about work-life control. And sometimes that means that you're actually very out of balance. And so if you're trying to build a business, you will likely find yourself having to play that balancing act, right, at some point. And reading about somebody like this, where there clearly wasn't balance, I think is very, very resonant. Makes you feel not alone, right? Book number 3, talk about a guy. Okay, this one's an interesting one. So this book is a beast of a book, and it's actually just book one of a 5-book series on this person. That's wild to think about. This book has won so many awards, though, the whole series. This author, Robert Caro, he wrote The Power Broker, another 1,100 page book about the great Robert Moses, who was a land developer out in New York. That book is incredible, too. But this book, I never would have imagined I would have been so drawn into this book. The person that it's about, I am not particularly interested in. And yet this story, man, this thing is so well written. But the story of this person who would go from the lowest of lows as a starting point to the highest of highs as the president of the United States. First of all, that's a pretty damn cool story to see somebody go from, like, you see where this person started at like the end of the 1800s, and you're like, what the fudge? Or 1900s rather, it would have been like 1880s or so. And you see like what his family came from. You're like, how did you ever, like, what are you talking about? How is this possible, right? The book is about Lyndon B. Johnson, former president. This one's called The Years of Lyndon Johnson, The Path to Power. And it's from like his grandparents all the way up until he becomes a senator. So very early in his career still. And first of all, this book is very intriguing because you leave very inspired, feeling like, okay, well, if he could do that from that low place, then surely I can do anything. But the other thing that you realize is that a lot of the people who are at the very top, they're broken. They're broken people. There's something about them that's not quite right. And reading about Lyndon, you go, oh, that man, he's not quite there. Like, often we wonder, when we think about champions, what do they have that I don't? And the reframe that's more powerful is to realize that they have something you don't, which is an off switch. This dude did not have an off switch. He worked so freaking hard. He worked himself into the hospital multiple times. Now, what he worked on and how he did it, that's a little bit sketchy, a little bit dubious. That's what makes the book so damn interesting. But you just see this recurring theme with all of these gentlemen. Whether it's Lyndon, it's Andre, it's William, all of these guys, they didn't have an off switch. They had very complicated psychologies and psyches, but when it came to their pursuit of their destiny, of what they perceived to be their greatness, they didn't have an off switch for it. And it's just really interesting to read about these people and to see glimpses of yourself into them, and then to be able to pattern recognize, okay, here's what's most likely to get me to where I want to go. It's not them reciting to you, here's the system, here's the formula. Because my problem with business books, and I've said this so many times in the past, is that business books are written from the perspective of the person who's already won the game, looking back and connecting dots that maybe didn't actually connect. But because they have to put it into a system, into a framework to package it up into a book that can be sold and that you could duplicate, they have to draw connections that may or may not have actually occurred, just for the sake of giving it some kind of structure. And so what that means is, who knows if that system actually was any good, if that's actually what led to their success. But reading about somebody's life as they go through, from childhood all the way until adulthood, you start to see it's not this linear experience. It's really messy, and more so the successful people I've had the pleasure of being around. It's not that they're looking for a system to duplicate. It's that they're looking for an ecosystem of data points that they can pattern match at future dates. That's what they're looking for. They're looking to have, I imagine it's kind of like the old nautical captains with their star charts as they're going across the Atlantic Ocean, and they have the stars in the sky, and they have their chart full of stars, and they can pattern recognize off that data to say, am I moving in the right direction? It's not a system. It's not get on the freeway, here's the sign, and 62 miles, take a right, and it's right there. It's not that. It's, okay, there's all this data out here. How can I pattern recognize based off of what I've seen and have before to get to where I'm trying to go? And that is the power of a biography. So go pick up these books, go read about all the great individuals of the past. I promise you, it's one of the activities that separates the very successful rich people from the very poor people, or poor at least culturally. They're missing out on a great opportunity. Maybe not financially, but read these books. You won't be disappointed. I'll see you guys in the next episode.